Tonight, the money man to the world tries to save the global economy, one country at a time.
By the way, do you ever get jet lagged? You said you spend 50% of your time traveling.
I forget about jet lag.
Also, the countries of Eastern Europe tasted the champagne of capitalism, only to end up with a bitter hangover.
If you're a country that's very highly indebted and global investors suddenly decide they want to hold less debt, you're going to get hurt.
And are Americans now being asked to prop up European banks?
Dan, that's the way it is everywhere in the world right now, right? It's a moment of bailing out the risk takers.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening. Tonight we give you a rare behind-the-scenes look at one of the world's most powerful institutions in action. With the worst economic crisis in decades spreading around the globe, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has rushed in to stabilize several countries as they teeter on the brink of insolvency. And the organization agreed to allow our cameras to document how the process works. The IMF is little known and less understood. It's based in Washington, D.C., but it seldom makes headlines in the United States, even though this country is its largest backer. But in other places, when the IMF shows up, it's front-page news, especially when its managing director decides it's important enough to personally pay a visit.
You managed a miracle.
What if you took one man, gave him $1 trillion, and asked him to go on a mission to save the global economy? He is one of the most important men in the world right now, and one you've probably never heard of. Dominique Strauss-Kahn is French. He calls himself a socialist, but he may hold the future of capitalism in his hands. He spends most of his life on the road. We caught up with him in Vienna, where he was meeting with nervous Austrian government officials who see Eastern European economies collapsing all around them.
Mr. Strauss-Kahn is, if I may say so, an old friend of Austria.
Strauss-Kahn leads the International Monetary Fund, or as it's commonly known, the IMF. What is your job?
I better know.
He's become a rock star in the financial world. At the helm of the IMF since 2007, Strauss-Kahn rose to prominence just a few months ago, when world leaders decided to put their faith and their money in the IMF. The United States, along with other rich nations, pledged $1 trillion to the IMF earlier this year and gave Dominique Strauss-Kahn the unenviable task of saving the world from economic collapse. At IMF headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, just down from the White House, he leads a suddenly growing staff of thousands of economists and financial experts who monitor balance sheets from the Baltics to Bangladesh. It hasn't been that long ago that the IMF was letting go some staff. They were shrinking their operations some. And then around the time of the G7 meetings, you took on a whole new significance. That's fair to say. Why was that?
You know, I could take an example of a firefighter. And when you don't have a fire, then you always find a lot of people saying, we don't need firefighters. We could save this kind of expenses.
Let's cut back on the fire department.
Well, exactly. So while during a couple of years, the world economy went well without any crisis, some people began to imagine, well, we get rid of all kind of crisis. We know how to manage the world economy without crisis. So we don't need the firefighters anymore. We won't have any fire anymore, which certainly was a bit foolish idea.
This chief firefighter for the world economy is a former finance minister of France, a lawyer, and a professor of economics who jets from hotspot to hotspot.
I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, that every day you're nervous. Not as a person, but you're nervous about the situation. This day, what are you most nervous about? Then the people around you, what are they most nervous about?
Well, I'm afraid they're nervous for several reasons, not only for one. Well, we're still monitoring the situation in Central Europe, as you say. We have concern about what's going on in Sri Lanka, the changes in the capital flows in Asia. So all the part of the world is moving always. And it doesn't mean that all these problems are big problems. They may be partly solved tomorrow. But one of the things which are interesting in the global economy is that things are always moving all around the world. And that's probably why this job is so interesting.
The International Monetary Fund is a UN agency with its own charter, and almost every country in the world is a member. It works much like a credit union, where countries will invest as shareholders by lending money to the IMF. Nations in trouble can then borrow from the IMF by agreeing to clean up their acts and get their books in order. So far this year, Strauss-Kahn's visited 26 countries. Here, in the Central African nation of Congo, the outstretched hands want something more than a handshake. They need money, fast. As in many of the world's poorest countries, the people here are the unwitting victims of this global economic crisis. They're the ones hit the hardest. Back in Vienna, Strauss-Kahn swept in for just one day. Austria's central bank governor was there to greet him.
And then after the breakfast?
It seemed like every banker in Vienna wanted to get close to him. Strauss-Kahn's schedule is an endless series of breakfast meetings, lunch meetings, dinner meetings, and even snack meetings.
We have a very special guest. It is the managing director of IMF, Mr. Strauss-Kahn.
And then there's meeting the press. At every stop, his words are analyzed by a world looking for rays of economic hope.
Strauss-Kahn, is it your judgment that the worst is over, still to come, or can't tell?
Well, I think that in some sense, the worst is probably behind us because we now have a clear view of the risk.
And with that, he was off. I joined him as he traveled to the next appointment on his whirlwind itinerary.
Before you got this job as an economist, you had a reputation of speaking your mind, being candid, straightforward. Do you have to hold yourself in a bit now with things like this press conference and meeting with the bankers?
No, at least not more than previously. I mean, I try to be candid. It doesn't mean that everything can be said anywhere at any time. Some things, especially in the economic field or in the financial world, has to be kept secret for a while because you have some risk, market risk, and so you can't say everything at any time. But my rule is to be as candid as possible and to really don't say things are going very well when I believe it's not the case and the contrary.
Well, we've arrived. By the way, do you ever get jet lagged? You said you spend 50% of your time traveling.
I forget about jet lag. If not, it's impossible to survive.
Helping countries survive has become a 24-hour job for Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
Hello. I'm very pleased to meet you.
With so many nations in trouble, he and his team are constantly plugging the economic dike with billions of dollars from, among others, the United States Treasury. European countries have also vowed to increase their lending to the IMF. That's because the fire has spread to their own backyard.
Hi, bonjour. Parlez français? Vous parlez français?
Strauss-Kahn says this is the first major European economic crisis since the Second World War.
If we want to have our role not only as firefighter when there is a crisis, but also preventing crisis, then we absolutely...
15 countries have had to seek urgent loans from the IMF since the crisis hit. Of those, half are in Eastern Europe. And the unrest has spread from the Balkan countries to the Ukraine. The entire region of former communist countries is on edge.
You know, many people have an opinion about the economy.
And right next door is Austria, where we first met up with Dominique Strauss-Kahn at a park in Vienna. I wanted his thoughts on why Americans, with so much trouble in our own economy, should help bail out Europe.
The collapse in the Eastern Europe economy immediately has as a result a collapse in the Western economy because French banks, Italian banks, German banks, UK banks are exposed to the risk. They finance things in Eastern economy, so they're exposed to this risk. And if the European economy goes down, then it's a big customer for the US economy which disappear. And then at the end of the day, how many people in Europe will go on buying US products if they don't have money anymore?
We're in Austria, and in Vienna, Austria at that. And I don't know better than to talk about Hitler in Austria. But is it too much to say that the one purpose in establishing the IMF was to try to prevent what happened with Germany in the wake of World War I, that the economy got in such bad shape that Adolf Hitler was, after all, elected in free elections as a response of people feeling desperate?
That's absolutely right. Not only what happened in Germany, but what happened in whole Europe, where economic war began among the countries to try to take advantage from devaluation and not to go in the direction of cooperation, or to the contrary, going in the direction of domestic solution. Germany was the biggest example, but not the only one. So what is at stake when we're looking at all this is peace and war. So it's very right to say that one of the main reasons for establishing this institution, and it's still important today, is finally to be part of the peace process.
So what happens when the IMF takes on a country in crisis? We traveled from Vienna to the east, through the plains of Central Europe, to a place where the free world and the communist bloc once met. This used to be a heavily fortified border. It now sits eerily silent and forgotten.
I'm standing on the bridge at Andal, on the border between Austria and Hungary. Back in 1956, more than 70,000 Hungarians escaped here from behind the Iron Curtain to the west over there, leaving behind Soviet communism. To stop the flight, the Hungarian army destroyed the original bridge, and it would take more than 30 years for the two sides to meet when the Soviet Union crumbled in 1989. That's when Eastern Europe set out to create its own free market economies, and that's when Western Europe rushed in to invest. For a while, both sides seemed to be winners.
This is Budapest, a gem of a city tucked into a gentle bend on the blue Danube River in Eastern Europe. These shops, these bustling restaurants, this pulsing street life didn't exist here 20 years ago. Budapest is the capital of Hungary, which for decades was shrouded by the Iron Curtain. Relics of that bygone era have been rounded up and placed in a park, a sort of graveyard, where Lenin and his comrades look out over a far different country. It's a country in which over 10 million Hungarians are free to go about their business. And that includes this man, Lajos Csiky-Béger, one of Hungary's most prominent businessmen. He puts his hyphenated last name on every one of his ventures, from his luxury car dealership to his health clubs. His story is the Hungarian dream come true. Before the fall of communism in 1989, Csiky-Béger was a medical student, an anti-communist protester who yearned to see what life was like on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
I had no freedom. I cannot get the passport to pass over the borders, to get information, to see what is over the borders, and I was so curious always.
So when the curtain fell in 1989, Csiky-Béger hit the road.
I crossed all over Europe, and I had 2 months spent on the summertime of 90 in Europe. It was a very big experience. I saw a lot of things, and what I saw in all Europe, it impressed me.
What impressed him were the fruits of capitalism, prosperous societies with thriving businesses and high standards of living. But of all the things he saw, he was most enamored with those wonderful European cars.
In the early 90s, in Hungary, we had only Russian cars. At that time, it was so easy to make business.
A business importing cars. Csiky-Béger started out selling used small trucks into a market starved for variety. The used car business soon turned into the new car business, which turned a budding entrepreneur into a wealthy man.
The growth in these years for the cars, it was growing 10, 15, 16%, and everybody was happy. Then this market, it's a never-ending story.
For all Hungarians, the dream of a Western way of life was there for the taking. Day by day, the capital city, Budapest, grew to look more like the shining cities of Western Europe. But the question was, how could Hungary afford it? They looked to foreign banks for help, and those banks were more than happy to oblige.
All of these international banks believed that this region, including Hungary and other countries, is really a source of growth for their business.
Adam Farkas was a financial whiz-kid in his native Hungary. He used to work here at the Hungarian Central Bank until he was recruited by a major German bank to set up their local subsidiary. At the dawn of the 21st century, Hungary was considered an exciting emerging market.
This region provided for these international banks better than average growth rate of income, of balance sheet, and also a better than average return on invested capital.
For the banks, the new Hungarian borrowers were a treasure trove. The more borrowers, the more interest payments flooding into the bank every month. So-called mother banks in the West rushed in to give as many loans as they could and set up shop after shop after shop in Budapest's historic buildings. For the first time in decades, Hungarians had access to credit, the mother's milk of capitalism. It was a whole new world.
So they developed a sort of false perception of safety, and people readily borrowed against their houses. They were readily going to the car dealers to buy cars, and they were readily spending on vacations and other needs because they had access to borrowing.
Hungarians were living on credit, and much of the money came from banks here in Vienna. Austrian bankers were more than happy to fuel the Hungarian buying spree.
Austrian banks were the main beneficiaries of the growth and the profit opportunities of these countries. And on the other hand, Austrian banks were taking the highest risk.
The banks, they was always offering better and better conditions for the customers. They was fighting for the customers.
And Cheeky Baker says the banks fought to give him loans as well. So he borrowed a lot of money to start even more ventures. He now has 14 companies, including a real estate development firm that built these houses on the outskirts of Budapest. He named it after himself. If you think this looks like suburbia USA, well, it does. And that's the point. This type of development is new to Hungary and is just another part of Cheeky Baker's vision, introducing the Western way of life to his fellow Hungarians.
We want to look as the Western countries, beautiful houses, beautiful shops, showrooms. I suggest you guest room or kids for your kids. If you cannot offer for these people life quality, life standards, they will be more frustrated or they will be more pessimistic.
There weren't too many pessimists in Hungary over the last few years. Easy credit has a way of breeding optimism for developers like Cheeky Baker and for the families looking to buy his houses. But it wasn't just Hungarian citizens and Hungarian businesses that got drunk on credit. Here at Parliament in Budapest, politicians also spent like mad, increasing the government payroll, beefing up the country's infrastructure, lavishing constituents with all sorts of benefits.
People demanded the government to spend, and the government could do this spending, and election promises and government programs went just in a sense, out of control, because this was satisfying people's illusion and satisfying people's expectations from the government. And it's just simply, nobody realized that it is not possible to continue forever.
Like most governments, Hungary is funded by taxpayers. But all the taxpayers together were not enough to foot the bill for all this government spending. So the state borrowed money from international investors who lined up to buy government bonds. And who were these investors? They were foreign banks, hedge funds, maybe your pension fund, or even the endowment at your alma mater. They were chasing high returns and ignoring the risk because during the boom, investors considered Hungary a very safe bet. And as long as someone would buy their bonds, the Hungarian government could keep on spending. In the middle of this borrowing binge, the Hungarians joined the European Union in 2004. It was yet another vote of confidence in their free spending wave. The boom continued for several years, a bubble of cheap credit, not unlike what was happening in the U.S. We all know now, too much credit was a bad thing, and some saw it at the time.
There was a lot of warning signals. These warnings were not heard, they were not taken as seriously, and they were not strong enough.
Despite the risks, Adam Farkas's bank, like most other European banks, continued to lend. And just when Hungary's rise seemed unstoppable, in 2007, trouble started brewing thousands of miles away in the U.S. housing market. Subprime loans to risky borrowers were starting to go bad. Investors worldwide panicked and suddenly questioned if their holdings were riskier than they ever wanted to believe. And then, in the fall of 2008, the banks in the United States, like Lehman Brothers, began to fail.
That's when the music stopped. The global credit crisis hit, and Hungary went from being a golden opportunity to a high-risk alert, and foreign investors shied away. The Hungarian government still needed credit to keep going, but now everyone turned them down. Right on the verge of bankruptcy, the Hungarians called the International Monetary Fund, lender of last resort to the world. Here at headquarters in Washington, D.C., James Morsink took the call.
On October 10th, the governor of the central bank gave me a call. I mean, it was clear that the house was on fire.
Within 48 hours, Morsink, an assistant director at the IMF's European department, was on a plane to Hungary.
They were essentially in desperate need of money right away.
Now, suddenly, the government in Budapest was on the brink of going broke. Hungary was facing the equivalent of a bank run on an entire country. And the bankers who were holding this debt feared losing millions overnight.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. So it was a big danger of the government not being able to fund itself.
If you're a country that's very highly indebted, whether it's external debt or government debt, and global investors suddenly decide they want to hold less debt, you're going to get hurt.
If a government were to run out of money entirely, a country, in some sense, could cease to exist as a sovereign state. It would default on its foreign debt, and there might be no funds for basic services, like the police, the court system, or public transportation. Trade might come to a halt. And in a global economy, if one country fails, its neighbor may be next. It was to prevent just such disasters that the IMF was created.
What we recognized immediately was the fact that Hungary's external debt was very high, including a very high level of government debt, that they faced immediate refinancing needs, and that to give confidence to external investors that these financing needs could be met, two things needed to be done. The government needed to put in place a set of policies that credibly restored macroeconomic stability over the next couple of years, and that would then allow us to provide upfront assistance to help stabilize the situation.
Within 3 weeks, Morsink had rustled up a $25 billion rescue package for Hungary with help from the European Union and the World Bank. That loan stopped the free fall of the Hungarian currency, and it prevented some panicky foreign investors from pulling their money out of the country. It was a classic example of the IMF acting as firefighter. But the IMF has other responsibilities, such as monitoring precarious economic situations before they become crises. And that begs this question: where was the IMF when Hungary was spinning out of control? One former high-ranking official is now saying the IMF knew there was a problem, but couldn't compete with powerful forces who were acting as cheerleaders.
The people in Brussels and the people in Frankfurt at the European Central Bank were encouraging all these East European countries, including Hungary, to grow fast, to plan on convergence into Euroland, as they call it.
For years, Simon Johnson had monitored Hungary from his post as chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He said he had warned governments in the East and the West that such rampant borrowing was unsustainable.
And there was a set of assumptions there that the IMF did resist to some degree, but not enough, because it turns out to be incredibly dangerous, what they've been doing.
Is or is not the IMF partially to blame for what's happened, or are they blameless?
No one is blameless. So the IMF must therefore share some responsibility. I think the people who sat at the policy tables, and I sat at some of these policy tables in these discussions, and I would claim that I did press to take this more seriously and do more, but I didn't speak strongly enough. I didn't, perhaps I deferred too much to the consensus. So I'm responsible also on those terms. Nobody backed away far enough and said, well, wait a minute, what are we doing with our broader financial sector here? What are the risks that we're creating? I mean, everybody, all the responsible policymakers, were in a very real sense asleep at the wheel.
Meanwhile, 3 months after the IMF's $25 billion loan to Hungary, James Morsink and his team are back in Budapest for a checkup.
Thank you. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Nice to see you.
They say they're pleased with the government's progress. Under the provisions of the loan, the Hungarians vowed to aggressively cut spending. That meant cuts in government programs such as sick leave, child care benefits, and a generous pension system, all in the name of trying to stabilize the larger economy.
We can't let the banking systems flounder. It's important that governments step up and provide the necessary support to keep their banking systems stable, both in the United States and in Western Europe, and also in this part of the world.
At lunch on his final day in Budapest, Morsink is confident the IMF loan has already helped Hungary.
The economic downturn would be a lot sharper here. Activity would fall more than it is already falling. Unemployment would rise higher. Households would be in more financial distress as they have difficulty servicing their mortgages. So things are not good now, but they could clearly be a lot worse.
For some Hungarians, the worst has already become a reality. Not far from the bustling outdoor cafe is the home of the Rakitovsky family. They first moved into this one-bedroom apartment in 2004, when Hungary's economy was growing at a staggering rate. To them, it was an attempt to reach the middle class.
Örömet. Ahogy bejöttem, szétnéztem, hát ekkora nagy lakás, hát az életünkben nem volt, meg rögtön már ugye, hát a terveim már.
Both István and his wife Beata grew up poor in communist Hungary. István lived with 10 brothers and sisters in a small apartment. His wife Beata had to share her bedroom with 6 siblings. They wanted more for their children, teenage István Jr. and 9-year-old Vivian. The apartment, though small by American standards, was a lavish space for a family that had been sharing about 250 square feet. And István liked that the apartment was a bit of a fixer-upper.
Elkezdtek járni az agyam, átépítem, átalakítom, és akkor elég is lenne ez nekünk bőven, ameddig élünk.
Before the economy crashed, István had steady work as a bricklayer. And when they found this apartment, it wasn't too hard to get a low-interest loan from an Austrian-owned bank. But their dream crumbled along with Hungary's economy. And a family who once gathered for meals of red meat and chicken now share a few plain hot dogs. And the apartment renovation plans are permanently on hold. István lost his job in early 2008, and the family fell behind on their loan payments. When he came to ask the bank to restructure the mortgage, he was informed it was already too late.
Mit? Hát szívinfarktust kaptam. Hát majdnem megbolondultam. Nem akartam elhinni. Nem is értesítettek.
The bank had already sold his loan to a collection agency, who told István he now owed a lot more than the original amount. One of the reasons was that István had gotten a mortgage in Swiss francs. That was common practice during the boom years. Banks offered the lowest interest loans in foreign currency. That was fine when the Hungarian currency was stable, but when it lost some of its value with the economic crisis, millions of loans like István's suddenly became a lot more expensive. The Rakitovskys were given 3 options: pay, move out immediately, or face eviction.
Én? Meghaltam volna legszívesebben.
More than anything, Istvan says he feels shame in front of his children. While the three older members of the family are deeply aware of their situation, young Vivian, who wants to be an actress, still can manage a smile. We asked Beata what might happen to her daughter if the family is forced onto the streets. She couldn't answer. They know that under Hungarian law, the state can take children under the age of 18 from their parents if a family becomes homeless. Like many Hungarians, Istvan is about to lose all hope.
Mivel a bank azt csinál az emberekkel, amit akar. Például velünk is, a családommal azt csinálja. Nem értesített minket, eladták, mehetünk az utcára. Kész. Nincs miről beszélni. Ilyenek a törvények.
The plight of the Rakitovskis is not unique. They are just one of thousands of families across Eastern Europe in desperate need of help. The Loan Victims Association is a non-profit that provides legal assistance and mortgage counseling to Hungarians trapped in foreign currency loans, mostly in Swiss francs and euros. The IMF says that in total, Hungarian households owe $25 billion to foreign banks, and those banks lent the money based on faulty assumptions.
The idea that living standards in Hungary would converge rapidly to living standards in Western Europe, and the fact that a lot of Western European banks entered the market, the banking market here in Hungary, and were able to extend loans at very low interest rates because their funding was from Western Europe, either in Swiss francs or in euro. So in a situation where you believe that this country is going to be doing fabulously for the foreseeable future, it appears to be a situation with very high reward and very low risk. So why wouldn't you take that risk?
But ordinary Hungarians complain it's mostly the risk takers who have been rewarded by the IMF billions. Those foreigners who bought Hungarian bonds. A lot of the money Morsink helped raise for Hungary has already left the country. The government prioritized paying off the foreign investors who helped fund its spending spree. Investors like those college endowments and pension funds we talked about earlier. The Hungarian government also pumped money into the banks, and a lot of it was spent propping up the local currency. Meanwhile, the pawnbrokers in Budapest are busy.
Earrings or for hands, or chains, wedding rings, yes. The wedding rings is the favorite.
The bars got crowded early in the morning, and ethnic tensions are on the rise. Much of the city still has the look and feel of prosperity, but empty storefronts, stalled building projects, and scenes of hardship are now common. The Hungarian economy is expected to shrink about 7% this year, and unemployment is expected to rise to 11%. There were some winners. Adam Farkas was able to leave banking at the age of 41 and says he now enjoys scuba diving in his free time. But entrepreneur Lajos Csikibeger is not as lucky. The banks who used to beat down his door offering loans are now demanding payment and see him as a liability.
Last year I was the VIP guest in every bank party. Today am I a big risk because I have big bank loans.
He's facing ruin. From the car dealerships that got him started to his housing development, which sits largely empty, much of it unfinished.
We see a lot of bankruptcies, and today I see then on the short future we will be more and more bankruptcies in Hungary because it has no compromises. The banks, they want everything.
And that brings us back to Austria and its gilded capital of Vienna. It is a city with a long history of wealth and power. Both are now at stake. It is here that we first met up with IMF Managing Director Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
There is a risk for all the banks in Europe, not especially in Austria.
His arrival in Vienna was big news because the Austrian banks are in a heap of trouble for their aggressive lending to Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe. When it came to taking risks in Eastern Europe, nobody could match the Austrians. If you're to add up their loans to the region, it comes to nearly $270 billion. That's the equivalent of 70% of this country's entire economy. The math is clear. The economic fire in Eastern Europe could easily consume Austria. The Austrian banks are hoping the IMF has stabilized the region just long enough for them to get their loans repaid. What is at stake is the Austrian way of life.
As the sun sets in Vienna and the IMF in Washington prepares for emergencies yet to come, fears linger that the crisis in Eastern Europe could turn a place even as grand and enduring as Austria into another subprime country.
So back at IMF headquarters in Washington, I asked Dominique Strauss-Kahn what the IMF loan meant for Hungary, Austria, and the rest of the world.
Well, as you know, we've spent some time now reporting in Hungary, getting around talking to people both high and low, and Hungary being a country that the IMF has provided some money to. Mm-hmm. True or untrue that by providing money to the country, which was your emphasis, they are using that money to provide money to the banks, right? Mm-hmm. But what puzzles some people, and I would say including myself, this is, and I'll use the word propping up, the same banks who invested there to begin with.
Yes, the point is, it's a difficult question because on one hand, you don't want to give money to the banks who failed and to the actors which was at the root of the crisis. On the other hand, there's no way to get rid of the crisis and recover without having a healthy banking sector. So the problem is not to help the bankers, but to help the banks. There's no way for a modern economy to work without banks. So at the same time, we need, I won't say to punish, but at least to blame those who failed. But in the same move, we need to rebuild a healthy banking sector.
When talking with people in Hungary, the country teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, that's not too strong to say, is it? Mm-hmm. The IMF comes, provides money for the government, but this places a very heavy burden on the people in Hungary.
Well, part of the problem comes from the fact that an emerging country like Hungary has relied during the last decade on a huge amount of foreign money invested in the country, which is just okay for an emerging country to receive foreign investment. So whose fault? Nobody really. It was correct for Hungary to try to develop its economy borrowing money abroad. It was correct for Western banks to try to finance it. It's understandable for those banks when they have troubles to try to come back home. The problem is that an economy is something which is somewhat fragile. When it works well, fine. When something begins not to work, then you really have to fix it very rapidly. If not, it may unravel. And that's our job, to try to fix it before the crisis becomes unmanageable.
Would Austria fall into the category that you mentioned before? Look, we only have so much money to lend now, so we're going to pull back and lend more in Austria rather than Hungary, or are they too far committed?
Well, the case of Austria is an interesting case because Austrian Bank tried to develop looking to the east. They had no way to develop to the west because they were facing two big banks in France, in Germany, in UK. So the only way for them to find a new market was to go east, and they went east very successfully. Now, the problem is that their clients in Eastern Europe becomes to be almost broken. And when you're a banker and you have broken clients, you're in trouble. So Austrian Bank were in trouble. And what is very remarkable in the case of Austria is that the size of those banks compared to the size of the country is very big. Again, I don't think it was wrong for Austrian Bank to try to find new customers and to finance Eastern Europe. The problem is sometimes some of them take risks which were probably somewhat too high, too important risk.
But I'm just trying to figure out here. Let's pause for a second. In the wake of the crisis, is this solution that you're working on, is it as fair as possible?
It's certainly as fair as possible. What do you mean exactly?
Well, the IMF obviously has a lot of interested parties here. I made a note they have governments, creditors, multinational banks. But what about the citizens?
Well, the ultimate goal of what we're doing as citizens. The only thing at the end of the day we're interested in is to maintain growth and employment. So the reason for this institution to provide financial stability, as it has been defined after World War II, is to realize that when you don't have this financial stability, then the risk of disruption in the economy are so big that at the end it can produce as a civil unrest and even international war. But certainly during the last 60 years, and again in this crisis, things are going much better thanks to institutions like the IMF than it would have been without those kind of institutions.
Director, thank you. Thank you very, very much. IMF Managing Director Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Up next on our program, a former top-level insider at the IMF says that the organization's approach to the global financial crisis is misguided. That part of the story when we come back.
Missed an edition of Dan Rather Reports? Or just want to see one again? We're now available on iTunes, so check us out.
We've seen tonight how the IMF has pumped billions of dollars of loans into Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe. But what happens if this isn't enough? If a bad economy becomes a whole lot worse? One former high-level staffer at the IMF thinks this frightening scenario is quite possible. Simon Johnson was the chief economist at the IMF until 2008. He is critical of what his former organization is doing in Hungary and what it means for the rest of the world.
It is absolutely true that if you come in and help a country, you are at least slowing down a decline. You're at least helping them do better than they would, without any support.
Cushioning the loss, if you will.
You're definitely trying to cushion the loss, and trying to help a country in the first instance when they get into this sort of trouble absolutely makes sense. Now, you can also raise questions about, who exactly is helped in that framework.
That is my question. Who exactly is helped? When the IMF moves into Hungary, who is helped?
Well, what we're looking at throughout Eastern Europe, actually, in fact, throughout the world, is obviously creditor bailouts. They're coming in to protect the Austrian banks. They're trying to help the Austrian banks get repaid on those loans. Now, the Hungarian government, I'm sure, will say to you, this is the best thing for their citizens.
They have said that. Yes.
Personally, I'm very doubtful that the historical record is clearly that when you get into the sorts of problems that Hungary has, you have to do the sort of bankruptcy process that you're doing for General Motors, where you restructure their debts. You have to do that for Hungarian households. It's messy, it's complicated, they don't want to do it, but the alternative is going to be a very big slowdown, a depression for Hungary.
Is that a real and working possibility, a depression for Hungary?
That's my baseline expectation. Unless the world economy turns around in a somewhat miraculous fashion.
You don't expect that?
I certainly don't expect that. Very few people expect that. Unless that happens, given the policies we're seeing in Hungary, given the problems, and given the amount of overborrowing they've had, they're going to have a long, dark slump, which we can argue technically is it a depression. It's going to feel like a depression to those people.
What are the risks of the current IMF policy?
Well, the main risk is that the economy really declines a great deal, that business stops, essentially, and that you don't get any kind of recovery, even if the world economy starts to stabilize. And then, of course, people start to default on that basis. So they don't default because you've moved the exchange rate and they can't afford their Swiss franc loans anymore. They default because they don't have a job anymore. They have no income.
Well, isn't that going to be a nightmare for Austria because the Austrian banks have invested so much in Hungary?
Well, it depends on how much money they're able to get out before people actually default on these loans. If you swap, so right now Hungary's borrowed from Austria, the IMF comes in and provides new loans. If those help the Austrian banks get their money out, then the Austrian banks won't get everything out, but they get protected from some of their losses, that downside protection provided by the IMF. And it's the IMF that has the claim on Hungary, not the Austrian banks.
Well, you used a phrase before, you said a creditor bailout. Does that mean bailing out the banks?
Well, it means bailing out the banks, but in a way that you protect the creditors, so that people who've lent money to the banks don't lose. And if you remember what happened with AIG, was that people were owed money by AIG, right? They'd lent money to AIG, and we now know that the way the government came in, they said you must pay out everything you owe. So we, the US taxpayer, paid out almost $200 billion to creditors of AIG, to people who had claims on AIG. Same principle for Hungary. Pay them out at 100 cents on the dollar. That's a complete creditor bailout.
Well, with the IMF, and again, let's use Hungary as just a case example, but are they helping the country or the creditors?
They are helping the creditors. They want to help the country. They should, and I think they can change the program. My view is, my perspective is always one of a constructive critic. I think you can argue, if you want to be charitable, that this was a sensible initial structure of the program before we saw what was happening in the world economy, before we realized we were not going to bounce back quickly. And now the program needs to be redone, and you need to have debt restructurings. And I think that it is really, if you're looking for people responsible outside of Hungary, constraints on the IMF, it's the Europeans, it's the West Europeans. Remember, they're very powerful at the IMF, and the IMF is representing its shareholders here. These very powerful, influential shareholders want to save the Austrian banks in this fashion. That's not appropriate.
Well, it strikes me, correct me if I'm wrong, that what's taking place here is we're bailing out the risk takers, that people took risks, banks, we want more profits, we want more deposits. Now, when the risks don't pan out, they don't have to fold their hand, they're getting these bailouts. Is that pretty much the way it is or not?
Dan, that's the way it is everywhere in the world right now, right? It's a moment of bailing out the risk takers, and not just the people, not just the firms, if you like, and not just the people who lent to those firms, the CEOs. Have any of the CEOs of these big Austrian banks been fired or lost their jobs? Not that I know of either. I mean, there's some catastrophic errors of business judgment that have been made. If you present this to any other, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT. I spend a lot of time with technology entrepreneurs. If you lay out to them the scenario that we're describing in terms of how badly these people have failed in their business, and then you say, and I propose that the CEOs should keep their jobs, anybody else from any other part of the US economy just will howl in derision at that idea. It is ludicrous.
And say they should be fired, they should be let go?
Absolutely. If you make a mistake, a business mistake, I mean, I'm not saying that there was a criminal error. I'm not saying they did anything unethical. There was a huge lapse of business judgment. In most of the corporate world, in the well-functioning corporate world, you lose your job for that.
If things don't go well in Hungary, is there a possibility of having to bail out the Austrian banks, or are we already bailing them out?
Well, we're already bailing them out, obviously. The question would be, if something happens, if it gets out of control and the Austrian banks are in trouble, would Austria as a country need form of external support, for example, from the IMF? I think the answer is yes, it may well. And I think that's something you should be planning ahead for. I think putting your head in the sand and saying, well, we'll stop it here, and we'll not have to worry about a second or third line of defense.
We'll stop it in Hungary.
Exactly. We don't have to worry about what we're going to do if it spreads to Austria, if it goes beyond Austria into Germany, for example. I think that's the kind of short-sighted thinking that got us into this mess in the first place.
Because if things get very much worse in Hungary, then we might be talking about trying to bail out the Austrian banks, and that would have effects in Germany and throughout Western Europe.
Yes, well, you'd be talking about not just bailing out the Austrian banks, but restructuring their obligations, restructuring their debts to other people. And where does that go? I mean, it's probably very hard in today's modern, complex financial world to figure out exactly who's going to be impacted by that. Could be Switzerland, for example. There's a lot of potential vulnerability there. So where does the chain go after Austria is something you need to be working on right now.
Well, surely we don't have to worry about Switzerland. I mean, this has been the financial bulwark of the Western financial world for, what, more than 100 years?
According to the numbers in the financial markets, Switzerland has bank size 8 times GDP. Okay? It's a massive multinational banking enterprise in a small country. You get banks that are much bigger than the economy. Switzerland doesn't belong to the euro, doesn't belong to even to the European Union. If their banks get into trouble, they're not just too big to fail, they may be too big to rescue.
Where did this idea of too big to fail come from? I never heard of it until fairly recently, that you would get too big to fail.
Well, too big to fail is you're right, it's a somewhat new idea as applied to the United States. Well, we haven't seen it in practice recently. Right. But it's a very old idea and a standard idea around the world. In many countries, say, take emerging markets again, somebody gets very big and powerful, they're close to the president, they run a massive bank, the bank has got 20% or 200% of GDP in terms of the value of the bank, the balance sheet of the bank, and you come in as the IMF when there's a crisis, And you look at this and you say, well, we need to fix this bank, but it's too big to fail. We need to, find other ways to restructure it or deal with it. Or maybe the president in some countries says, actually, you can do lots of things, you can't touch the bank because that's run by my brother-in-law, and we've made sure it's too big to fail.
Or my big campaign contributor.
Absolutely. It takes the connections, the form of connections between big business and government takes lots of different forms, corruption or campaign contributions, or they're my friends, or I just believe in them and what they mean for the future of this country. But the key thing is, you make yourself so big that if you go bankrupt, it's going to cause millions of people a great deal of hardship. Then you're too big to fail, and then you get a bailout.
What about the argument? Listen, the market is self-corrective. Don't get regulation. Let the market run, and the market will correct itself. What, if anything, is wrong with that?
I think that's the most dangerous idea possible right now. Because I actually don't think, I think that the panic phase of our current crisis is largely over, and the economy will start to come back. But we haven't changed or fixed the fundamental problems. The crisis hasn't broken the power or changed the mentality or at all altered the behavior of the big banks and the people who run them. So if you have the same structure that got us into this trouble, you've poured in massive subsidies to support them through the crisis, and now they say, well, look, we bounced off the bottom, the economy's coming back, let the market sort itself out. The market will lead you into another bubble, another crash, and we already increased our debt by a lot.
You're scaring me,
Good. I want to scare you. I think we should be scared. We should look at these things straight on, and we should not allow ourselves the kind of wishful thinking that got us into this mess. And we should look at the power structures that lie behind this. I mean, I'm an economist. I'm a mainstream economist. I was chief economist of the IMF. I know this is uncomfortable stuff for Americans to talk about in these terms, but these are the terms the IMF uses and most economists use to talk about almost all other countries in the world. The exceptionalism of the United States, I think, is exploded. It was a myth, and we're just like many other countries that get themselves into trouble.
Former IMF chief economist Simon Johnson. Now, when we return, a final thought. So stick here with us. Welcome back. The stature of the IMF has been bolstered by this economic crisis, but here in the United States, its approach remains controversial. Congress just recently approved another $100 billion line of credit to the IMF, but many in Congress protested the increased funds, saying they opposed handing U.S. dollars to an international organization bent on bailouts, and they feared the IMF may even lend to countries like Venezuela and Iran in the future. Tonight, we've seen the International Monetary Fund in action, and we've heard the same two basic arguments that we've been told here at home. One states that banks are too big to fail, and that if we, the taxpayers, don't come to rescue them, the economy will get much worse. The other says the banks were the ones that got us into this mess in the first place, that they should pay for their own mistakes, and that any rescue plan should be directed at average citizens and the economy as a whole. In this debate, the decision has already been made. Both in the United States and with the IMF in a global context, politicians have bet that rescuing the financial system on a worldwide basis is the best way to quell the fires of economic crisis. Right or wrong, we all have to hope it works. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. Today you're nervous. Not as a person, but you're nervous about the situation. This day, what are you most nervous about? Then the people around you, what are they most nervous about?
Well, I'm afraid they're nervous for several reasons, not only for one. Well, we're still monitoring the situation in Central Europe, as you say. We have concern about what's going on in Sri Lanka, the changes in the capital flows in Asia. So all the part of the world is moving always. And it doesn't mean that all these problems are big problems. They may be partly solved tomorrow. But one of the things which are interesting in the global economy is that things are always moving all around the world. And that's probably why this job is so interesting.
The International Monetary Fund is a UN agency with its own charter, and almost every country in the world is a member. It works much like a credit union, where countries will invest as shareholders by lending money to the IMF. Nations in trouble can then borrow from the IMF by agreeing to clean up their acts and get their books in order. So far this year, Strauss-Kahn's visited 26 countries. Here, in the Central African nation of Congo, the outstretched hands want something more than a handshake. They need money, fast. As in many of the world's poorest countries, the people here are the unwitting victims of this global economic crisis. They're the ones hit the hardest. Back in Vienna, Strauss-Kahn swept in for just in the IMF. The United States, along with other rich nations, pledged $1 trillion to the IMF earlier this year and gave Dominique Strauss-Kahn the unenviable task of saving the world from economic collapse. At IMF headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, just down from the White House, he leads a suddenly growing staff of thousands of economists and financial experts who monitor balance sheets from the Baltics to Bangladesh.
It hasn't been that long ago that the IMF was letting go some staff. They were shrinking their operations some. And then around the time of the G7 meetings, you took on a whole new significance. That's fair to say. Why was that?
You know, I could take an example of a firefighter. And when you don't have a fire, then you always find a lot of people saying, we don't need firefighters. That's just we could save this kind of expenses.
Let's cut back on the fire department.
Well, exactly. So, while during a couple of years, the world economy went well without any crisis, some people began to imagine, well, we get rid of all kind of crisis. We know how to manage the world economy without crisis. So we don't need the firefighters anymore. We won't have any fire anymore, which certainly was a bit foolish idea.
This chief firefighter for the world economy is a former finance minister of France, a lawyer, and a professor of economics who jets from hotspot to hotspot.
I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, that
one day, Austria's central bank governor was there to greet him.
And then after the breakfast?
It seemed like every banker in Vienna wanted to get close to him. Strauss-Kahn's schedule is an endless series of breakfast meetings, lunch meetings, dinner meetings, and even snack meetings.
We have a very special guest. It is the managing director of IMF, Mr. Strauss-Kahn.
And then there's meeting the press. At every stop, his words are analyzed by a world looking for rays of economic hope.
Strauss-Kahn, is it your judgment that the worst is over, still to come, or can't tell?
Well, I think that in some sense, the worst is probably behind us because we now have a clear view of the risk.
And with that, he was off. I joined him as he traveled to the next appointment on his whirlwind itinerary.
Before you got this job as an economist, you had a reputation of speaking your mind, being candid, straightforward. Do you have to hold yourself in a bit now with things like this press conference and meeting with the bankers?
No, at least not more than previously. I mean, I try to be candid. It doesn't mean that everything can be said anywhere at any time. Some things, especially in the economic field or in the financial world, has to be kept secret for a while because you have some risk, market risk, and so you can't say.
Tonight, the money man to the world tries to save the global economy. one country at a time.
By the way, do you ever get jet lag? You said you spend 50% of your time traveling.
I forget about jet lag.
Also, the countries of Eastern Europe tasted the champagne of capitalism, only to end up with a bitter hangover.
If you're a country that's very highly indebted and global investors suddenly decide they want to hold less debt, you're going to get hurt.
And are Americans now being asked to prop up European banks?
Dan, that's where it is everywhere in the world right now, right? It's a moment of bailing out the risk takers.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening. Tonight we give you a rare behind-the-scenes look at one of the world's most powerful institutions in action. With the worst economic crisis in decades spreading around the globe, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has rushed in to stabilize several countries as they teeter on the brink of insolvency. And the organization agreed to allow our cameras to document how the process works. The IMF is little known and less understood. It's based in Washington, D.C., but it seldom makes headlines in the United States, even though this country is its largest backer. But in other places, when the IMF shows up, it's front-page news, especially when its managing director decides it's important enough to personally pay a visit.
You managed a miracle.
What if you took one man, gave him $1 trillion, and asked him to go on a mission to save the global economy? He is one of the most important men in the world right now, and one you've probably never heard of. Dominique Strauss-Kahn is French. He calls himself a socialist, but he may hold the future of capitalism in his hands. He spends most of his life on the road. We caught up with him in Vienna, where he was meeting with nervous Austrian government officials who see Eastern European economies collapsing all around them.
Mr. Strauss-Kahn is, if I may say so, an old friend of Austria.
Strauss-Kahn leads the International Monetary Fund, or as it's commonly known, the IMF.
What is your job?
I better know.
He's become a rock star in the financial world. At the helm of the IMF since 2007, Strauss-Kahn rose to prominence just a few months ago, when world leaders decided to put their faith and their money